Hello, English 405 students. This is Dr. Martin. I'm giving you a short introduction to this week's work in literary theory. Um, in essence, what you're doing is choosing either feminism or postmodernism, and I'm fine if you choose a different chapter, and deciding A, first you're reading it, and B, deciding what literary or film piece that you want to apply the methodology to. This video is meant to demystify the process, provide a few examples, and introduce you to literary theory. By now, I am almost done with all capstone thesis projects, and so you've got that to work on as well. In terms of revising and rethinking, we'll be having conferences on them next week or video exchanges, so you'll be getting direct feedback. So first, why I'm having this unit, this unit of literary theory. If you go into graduate school, you will be required to know literary theory. It would be like a language that people would be already speaking that you want to have some knowledge of. And it's been a dominant way to approach literature for the past few decades. Different types of literary theory come into vogue. It was new criticism in the early 20th century. These days, it's historical criticism or race-based criticism, for lack of a better term. But the two that I'd focused on were feminism and postmodernism. I think you're going to find of the two, feminism the more palatable, though postmodernism is fascinating in and of itself. For postmodernism, well, first, for both chapters, if you can, the easiest thing for you to do would be to look at the stop and think section and the what postmodern critics do section, which is later on, or what feminist critics do section. It provides a list in distilled, distinct form of what the theory means, and then you would apply it to the literary or film work in question that you've chosen for your video presentation. Do make sure for your video presentation you're in front of the screen and I can see you. Please speak naturally and just try to apply the theory creatively to the work in question. So feminist literary theory, I think, is the more palatable simply because you could think about it in terms of literally the representation of women in literature, something we've been doing for a long time. If you're uncomfortable with the word feminism, think of gender-based or sex-based forms of criticism and the way that women are portrayed in literature. Peter Barry is the author. He puts literary theory into a very simplified form, though I think that some sections of this book are still rather complex. And he sets up for feminist theory multiple historical periods. He calls them the advent of women's writing, where women were written about as kind of an opaque form, where women were developed a little bit more. This might be diaries, personal writings. And then finally, feminist criticism he talks about in the 20th century. And for that, he tries to connect the 20th century movement to larger movements with women's rights. So we are talking about something that's directly related to the social and the political world and the cultural milieu of it. But what it means is you're looking for the ways that women are always trying to kind of get out of the box, for lack of a better term. The reference he uses is to the mad woman in the attic. That is Mr. Rochester's original wife, who is living upstairs. And in that sense, the female is always kind of restrained by social mores and social ideals. And in many respects, we look at feminist criticism. Like the chapter has a densely theoretical part where he talks about écriture féminine. It's a term by the French theorist Hélène Cixous, and basically it just means a female form of writing that is not logical, that is meant to challenge male-based models of order and logic. But if you're looking at what feminist criticism would mean and what it would do, we can look at the Wuthering Heights example in just a moment. But you look at the way that female writing, literature written by females, literature written about females by males or their genders, and you look at the ways that women are represented. You look at the ways that such representation shows a struggle for female representation, female forms of writing, female forms of sovereignty and self-autonomy. And you look at the way that there are larger institutions at play that force the female hand. I can think of early on, much female writing focuses on the woman getting a marriage partner, and that's basically her quest in life. And this would be the British novel for much of history. But if you're looking for other things, let's talk about the Wuthering Heights example. And again, to get to the crux of each chapter, read it, but also look for the What Feminist Critics or Postmodern Critics Do section. In that one, the idea is there's symbolic castration. And what that means is the female is given or forced into giving up her autonomy when she enters into the social world. And this would mean for Catherine in Wuthering Heights, when she goes to the Grange and she has to give up her autonomy afterwards. Barry sets it up in a very unique way and says that the dog is a phallic symbol when it bites her. There's phallic imagery, there's sexual imagery, that kind of thing. And this means when she looks in the mirror, she can't recognize her reflection, which I think is, if not anything else, is a very creative reading. What that means for you is that, like, if you look at Wuthering Heights, you look at this love story in this example, for a woman to enter into a social contract such as marriage or into a relationship or into the social world, she must give up her autonomy. We look at the ways that females are written about and the way that females write. We look at female genres, diaries, etc., private writing. I'm teaching Dickinson now. She would be a perfect example. In another class I'm teaching her. But review that chapter. Postmodern criticism is a little different. And the chapter starts off with referencing Jürgen Habermas, Jean-Francois Lyotard. You'll get a little bit lost in the theoretical material if you do choose this chapter, but I think there's a lot there. The first thing that's mentioned is the advent of modernism from the late 19th century into the first part of the 20th century. I usually think of the World Wars, World War I, and maybe a little bit into World War II. That's a little later. What that means is modernists were noting that Western dominance was waning, and there's a lament in T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland for the loss of a cohesive Western whole. Not that there ever was one, with Western notions of Christianity and so forth. Modernism was experimental in form. Poetry was very experimental. They tried new genre conventions. Some of it is very dense and abstruse. I'm thinking of The Wasteland. So modernists supposedly look towards the past and lament a lost whole, WHOL. Postmodernists look at that past and look at the fracture and the fragmentation, see that as being liberating. And so what you basically look for, and this is something that I think you'll notice from contemporary or modern day pop culture, is a certain degree of self-reflexivity. That's one of the things I think that Barry mentions. Irony, pastiche, all those things. If a narrator in a book stops the book and starts addressing the reader, or if you're watching a play on stage and the actors break the fourth wall and address the audience, that is generally considered a moment of postmodern self-reflexivity. You're aware of the conventions that you're watching or reading a fictive work by a direct commentary about that. So postmodernism, I guess, here's an example. So my wife likes Mark Rothko. If you don't know him, he's the one who, a painter who has, it's basically just orange and red. Like literally they're blocks of color, right? You may have seen this artwork before. I should have had it behind me. But the idea would be that it's not representing anything. I've heard people say that that type of art is not any art whatsoever. I could do that art. Is what the idea is. Barry mentions a theorist named Jean Baudrillard and simulacra and simulations. He's a French theorist, and the thing that Baudrillard says is that we never get to the crux of the thing. We always get to a representation of an object. For example, a painting of a still life. That would be flowers, a vase, whatever, something, a domestic object that's being painted. The painting itself is a representation of that real object. You with me? Baudrillard says we live in the simulation of the simulation of the simulation. So you get to the painting of the real object, right? And then you keep going, and eventually we live in the simulacra of images in our mind. And he says we don't have recourse with the real world in that respect. So the Rothko painting has no representation whatsoever. It's just showing us the absence of represented object. All right, so you look for that. The dominant metaphor that Baudrillard uses is of Disney World, and he says that he gives us the fantasy of the real. We go there, we experience Norway, Ethiopia, at the Epcot Center or whatever, but it is a simulation, or a simulacra is the term that he uses. There's other things in the chapter like meta-narratives, and meta-narratives are basically stories about stories. So the meta-narrative of anything, Christianity, feminism, whatever. Christianity would be the end would be the second coming and the ascension of the self into another world. Any type of meta-narrative that has a beginning, middle, and end. Feminism, the end would be the equal rights for all women with men, and etc. Same, whatever. Whatever story you get to that has a large-scale ending, they doubt. They call this a meta-narrative. Instead, they're interested in mini, M-I-N-I, narratives. They'd rather look at the local. They'd rather look at the body, and they don't think that meta-narratives exist. That's just a story we say. And so you'll get these postmodern works that are really short, that are like little chapters, and they might be from one person's point of view. Then another one might be from another person's point of view. Can't talk today. And all those things seemingly come to play. So if it's fragmented, if there's parody, if there's a direct address of the reader, if there's a critique of meta-narratives, if there's a discussion of a simulated world that shows the lack of own reality and groundedness in our own, that's postmodernism. There are many other chapters of the book. I am partial to the environmental or eco-criticism chapter if you're looking for another one besides these two. But you need to choose. And let's say you did choose feminism or postmodernism, and you could use Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher. For feminism, I would look at the figure of Madeline, and then look at the way that she enters into a symbolic world and is left out of the equation. She's literally buried, presumably alive. And I look at the way that male-based models of power function in the work. It's Roderick Usher and his friend, his unnamed friend, who's the narrator. If it was postmodernism, I would look for things like paintings in a literary work. I'd look for representations of an object and stories. In The Fall of the House of Usher, the narrator gets into kind of a weird, if you haven't read it, he gets into a weird other world with Roderick Usher. And the things that they read on pages become reality. Stories become reality because he's developed like a similar psychological correlation. It does well with psychoanalysis too. That's another lovely chapter in our book. But if I were doing that for postmodernism, I would talk about how that's a simulated world, how the main story, the main idea that the narrator has, he's going to help his friend, is a meta-narrative that never comes to fruition. I won't give away the ending of The Fall of the House of Usher. But I would look at those things. Just be creative. Find one work to use. I wish you well this week. Take care.